He saved lives under fire, but in old age, he was left with nothing. No pension, no housing, no medical help. His name was erased from the records, his heroism credited to someone else, and when he tried to set the record straight, he was arrested. A veteran with medals in a shoebox became just another burden to the country he served. Unjust, or just? If it feels wrong to you, write down your opinion in the comments. The wind rattled the aluminum siding of the trailer like distant gunfire. Inside, Harold Boone sat hunched over a cup of instant coffee, steam curling past the stubble on his gaunt cheeks. His breath fogged the cracked window as he stared at the line of sagging mailboxes outside. None ever held anything for him except rejection notices, past due bills, and the occasional ad promising miracle weight loss. He shifted in his threadbare chair, the springs whining beneath him. On the floor by his feet sat a shoebox, faded, torn, taped along the edges. He pulled it into his lap like a ritual. Inside, a bronze star, 2 purple hearts, a ribbon for valor. A letter from the governor once thanking him for exemplary service to the state and nation. He ran his fingers over the medals, dull and forgotten, the way you'd touch a wound long scarred over. The letter crackled when he lifted it. The signature had smudged in a water leak years ago. Even the ink had started to forget him. Once, he'd been Staff Sergeant Boone, Echo Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. Jungle warfare, search and rescue, convoy escort. Now, in the eyes of the system, he was Harold M. Boone, age 72, uninsured, unverified, and unlisted. It had started with the pension freeze, a clerical error, they said. VA told him to reapply. His claim got lost, then denied, then appealed, then stalled. Every call ended the same, please hold, we're transferring you. Each time, he was bounced between departments like a man being passed down a chain of forgetting. His military ID had expired 10 years ago. A new one required verification, records they couldn't locate. They called it misfiled. He called it erased. He tried visiting the Veterans Center downtown last winter. Just wanted a hot shower. But when the volunteer scanned his ID and frowned, Harold already knew. Sorry sir, we can't validate your service. He left without speaking. Now he lived in the woods behind the freight yard in a trailer someone sold him for $400. It leaned to the left and had no insulation. When it rained, water dripped onto the hot plate. He kept a bucket underneath. The shoebox slid from his lap and landed on the floor. A small framed photo clattered out, 4 men in camo, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning through grime and sweat. Afghanistan, 1985. Only 2 of them were still alive. One had vanished, and the 4th had received a hero's burial last year. Harold hadn't even been invited. He leaned back and stared at the stained ceiling. Some battles ended with medals. Others ended with silence. He turned on the radio, just static. He flipped through a stack of papers on the table, 2 rejection letters from housing support, a hospital bill he couldn't pay, and a final notice from the DMV. He'd sold the car 2 years ago, but apparently still owed a registration fee. He thought of his younger self, sharp eyes, strong hands, boots polished, orders crisp. He remembered the smell of diesel on desert wind. The dull thud of mortar shells in the distance. The feeling of being needed. Now, even his body had started betraying him. The tremors came at night, fingers twitching against nothing. His knees ached. His back stiffened like rusted metal. But the worst pain wasn't physical. It was erasure. A few months ago, he'd gone to a city council meeting to speak during public comment. He waited 2 hours, then approached the mic. I served 30 years, he'd said. And I can't even afford a place to die. They cut his mic at the 3-minute mark. No one looked up. In the alley behind St. Augustine's Free Clinic, Harold sat curled beneath a torn army blanket, knees to his chest, eyes fluttering from exhaustion and fever. A thin stream of vomit had dried along the concrete next to him. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, only drank from a leaking hose behind the thrift shop. Earlier that morning, he'd stood in line for over an hour, hoping for an aspirin, maybe a sandwich. But when he finally reached the front, the nurse glanced at his name, typed it in, and shook her head. Sorry, sir. You're not in the system. He tried to argue, voice low and hoarse. I served 3 decades. Just need. Sir, she said firmly, motioning to security. You're holding up the line. They didn't throw him out. Not with their hands. Just with their eyes, blank, tired, trained not to see men like him. By noon, he wandered into a strip mall, delirious from heat and hunger. The bright lights of a convenience store lured him inside like a desert mirage. He grabbed a microwavable burrito and walked up to the counter. $2.50, the clerk said. Harold's hand trembled as he pulled out a crumpled dollar bill and some coins. Still short. Sir, either pay or leave. He dug into his pocket, pulled out something small, a pin. His old unit insignia, scratched but clean. He placed it on the counter. What the hell is this? The manager appeared, broad and impatient. We're not a pawn shop. Get out. Outside, he stood dazed. The smell of the burrito still clung to his hands. Hunger felt like a knife now, sharp, insistent. He leaned against a pole and slid to the ground. And cried. Not sobs, not howls. Just silent, empty leaking. The kind that left no sound, only shame. A week later, he returned to the War Memorial Park. Not for vengeance, not even for reflection, but because it was the only place in town where benches weren't locked or patrolled. He sat under the statue of a kneeling soldier, eyes closed. His stomach was gnawing itself. His breath came slow. 2 teenagers skated nearby. One of them pointed. Dude, that guy's a zombie. They laughed and kicked gravel his way. Then came the guard. You can't sleep here. I'm not, Harold muttered. The guard stared. I've seen you before. Last month, right? You again. I served. Doesn't give you the right to camp out. Harold stood, stiff. The blood rushed from his head. Don't make me call it in, the guard warned. For a moment, Harold looked up at the towering statue. The polished bronze. The inscription below it read, "To the brave who served with honor." He looked down at himself, threadbare coat, shaking hands, boots with soles peeling off. Where do they go? He asked aloud. The brave, after the flags are folded. The guard didn't answer. Just tapped his radio and waited. That night, Harold returned to the trailer. A storm had knocked out the power line, no lights, no heat. Water dripped steadily onto the pan he'd left on the floor. He lit a candle and sat by the window, blanket over his shoulders. In his lap, the shoebox again. He pulled out each medal, lining them on the table like fallen chess pieces. Then he pulled out the photo. 4 men. Brothers. Dead, lost, forgotten, and him, the last one left. He folded the photo gently and stared at the candle. They didn't just forget me, he whispered. They erased me. It started with a name. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in 30 years. Martin D. Keller. The bronze plaque beneath the war statue at Founders Plaza bore the name proudly, etched in bold letters, Staff Sergeant Martin D. Keller, hero of Operation Crimson Echo. Harold stared at it for a long time, the hunger in his belly forgotten, the tremor in his hands stilled. He reached forward and touched the name, the metal warm under the sun. Keller. The men who froze behind cover. The men who couldn't pull the trigger. The men Harold had dragged out of the blast zone while rounds cracked overhead and shrapnel rained like cursed confetti. The men who later gave the interview, took the photos, received the commendation. And the men who never looked Harold in the eyes again. Harold's lips pressed into a flat line. That operation had left him with 2 cracked ribs, 1 ruptured eardrum, and night terrors that didn't fade with time. Yet here Keller was, immortalized in metal, while Harold rotted in a trailer behind a junkyard. For years, he had told himself it didn't matter. That the truth was something you carried inside, not something carved into monuments. But now, seeing that plaque, in this city that had chewed him up and spat him out, something ancient and feral woke in him. He didn't plan to do it. Not at first. But that night, sleep refused to come. The trailer creaked under the wind, and his memories clawed at the inside of his skull. He saw the desert again, heard the crackle of the radio, Keller's panicked voice stammering over the comms, I can't move. Boom. Boom. Then the firefight. Then dragging Keller behind the Humvee. Then waking up in the medical tent to find Keller gone, and a general shaking his hand for a heroism award he never received. Harold sat up, sweating, breathing hard. He grabbed his old rucksack from beneath the cot. It still held a few remnants, a canteen, dog tags, and a red permanent marker he once used to label boxes at the food bank. He shoved the marker in his pocket. At dawn, he returned to the plaza. It was empty except for a groundskeeper spraying the hedges. Harold waited until he left, then walked slowly toward the monument. He stood in front of the plaque, just as the sun peeked over the rooftops. And he uncapped the marker. His hands trembled. He took a breath. Then, in large letters beneath the etched name, he wrote, "Not the hero." He stepped back, blinking at the red ink against bronze. His heartbeat was thunder. He didn't feel rage or triumph. He felt seen. As if for the first time in decades, he existed. He walked away. But someone else had seen it, too. It took only 30 minutes before a teenager walking his dog spotted the graffiti. He pulled out his phone, smirking. "Yo, someone defaced the statue downtown." He filmed a quick video, panned to the writing, and posted it to TikTok with the caption, "Old vet went rogue, calling out fake war hero." By noon, the video had 100,000 views. By 2, the police showed up at the plaza. By 4, someone recognized Harold in the footage and posted his name. By 5, they arrested him near the freight yard. The holding cell was colder than his trailer. The fluorescent light hummed overhead as he sat on a bench, hands cuffed in front of him. A young officer glanced over the paperwork and muttered, "You tagged a war memorial. That's a felony." Harold didn't answer. Another officer walked by, paused, and looked closer. "Hey, weren't you in Echo Company? 3rd Battalion?" Harold blinked. "Yeah." The officer nodded slowly, a wrinkle of recognition on his brow. "My dad served with them." Silence. For the first time in years, Harold murmured, voice raspy, "Someone looked at me." The officer said nothing, just stared a little longer than usual before walking off. That night, the news ran a story titled, "Veteran arrested after vandalizing war memorial, claims plaque tells a lie." A blurry shot of Harold in handcuffs filled the screen. The anchor moved on quickly. But somewhere, a young journalist took note. And a public defender opened a file. The truth had been scratched onto metal. But the echo of that act had just begun. The courtroom smelled like old paper and worn-out apologies. Harold sat stiffly at the defendant's table, hands folded in front of him, as the bailiff called out his name like it was just another case. Boone, Harold M., vandalism of public property. His public defender, a wiry young man named Cruz with 2 short sleeves and too many files, leaned over and whispered, "Don't say anything today. Just sit tight." Harold nodded, barely hearing him. His focus was on the judge's bench, the state seal carved above it, bold, official, and indifferent. But in the back row of the courtroom sat a stranger with a notebook. She looked barely 30, with a press badge clipped to her cardigan. Her name was Elena Tran, a freelance journalist covering Forgotten America. Something about Harold's mugshot, paired with that red marker message, had stuck in her mind. That night after the arraignment, she tracked down an old news clipping from 1992. Sergeant Martin Keller awarded Silver Star for valor in Crimson Echo mission. The photo showed Keller standing rigid beside a general, metal gleaming. In the background, barely visible, a man in a hospital bed. Bandaged ribs. Missing dog tags. His name wasn't listed. But his eyes matched the ones in the viral arrest video. Cruz, the defender, wasn't convinced at first. "I'm trying to keep him out of jail, not start a war with the Department of Defense." But Elena pressed. "There's more here. He didn't deface that plaque for attention. He did it because that statue's a lie." They dug deeper. Cruz submitted FOIA requests for military records. Elena reached out to Harold's old unit. Most had scattered. Some were dead. A few didn't return calls. But one did. Dr. Robert Green. Former field medic. Now a retired orthopedic surgeon in Ohio. His voice cracked over the phone. I remember Boone. He pulled two of us out of that canyon when the truck was hit. I couldn't walk. Keller. Keller froze. Boone didn't say a word afterward. Just kept packing bandages and moving on. We thought he got decorated too. Are you telling me he didn't? The documents trickled in. Mission logs. Redacted after-action reports. Photos. And then, a classified memo with a single damning line. Boone recommends no formal report on Keller's inaction to preserve unit morale. He had protected Keller. Silently. At his own expense. Cruz brought the new evidence into the courtroom 2 weeks later. This time, reporters filled the gallery. The judge wore a skeptical expression but allowed the hearing. Elena wrote her first article that night. The Men Behind the Marker, Forgotten Hero or Systemic Failure. It caught fire. Veterans forums exploded. Old soldiers reposted it with captions like, "Sounds about right," and, "Too many stories like this." One man flew in from Montana just to testify, said Harold saved his brother's life in '85. Another sent in photos, Harold holding a rifle, sunburned and grinning beside their Humvee. And then came the email from a Pentagon aide. The department is opening an internal inquiry into record discrepancies related to Operation Crimson Echo. We appreciate your patience. Harold sat in the courtroom day after day, face blank, emotions coiled like rusted springs. He said little. He simply listened. And as the truth took shape around him, through testimonies, exhibits, and a growing public outcry, he finally allowed himself a thought he hadn't dared entertain in years. Maybe they'll hear me. Cruz stood at the end of the fourth day and said, "Your Honor, what my client did was not vandalism. It was history correction, in red ink, because black wouldn't get noticed." The courtroom murmured. The judge didn't smile. But he nodded. The city council chamber had never been this full. Reporters lined the walls, their lenses focused on the center table where Harold Boone sat, his hands steady for the first time in months. Behind him, rows of veterans, some in faded caps, others in wheelchairs, filled the seats, their faces marked by the same battles, the same years of dust and denial. A few held signs. Truth deserves a uniform. He didn't vanish. You looked away. The city had called this hearing as a formality, a gesture to address concerns regarding veteran record integrity. But the crowd made it something else entirely. It had become a reckoning. A retired lieutenant colonel took the stand first. He had flown in from Georgia. With tears in his voice, he spoke of the Boone he remembered, calm under pressure, fearless in chaos, never one for the spotlight. Then came Robert Greene, the medic, who looked directly at the city officials and said, "If Boone had stayed behind that day, I'd be dead. And Martin Keller would have gone home early, if he hadn't lied." The room was silent. Attention hung like fog. Councilmember Lewis, who had denied Boone's public housing request 2 years earlier, now cleared his throat and read from a sheet of paper. "We acknowledge that Mr. Boone's contributions were not accurately recognized due to bureaucratic errors and oversights. We offer an official apology on behalf of this body and the city." Harold didn't move. He stared at the man like he was just another passing cloud. "We have worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs to expedite full restoration of all benefits," Lewis continued. "That includes back pay, medical coverage, and housing assistance." He placed a thick envelope on the table beside Boone. The crowd clapped. Some stood. Others saluted. But Harold remained seated. Afterward, outside the building, microphones swarmed him. "Mr. Boone, how do you feel? Do you accept the city's apology? What will you do with the settlement money?" He raised a hand. The crowd hushed. "I didn't come here for money," he said. "Or headlines. I came because a man lied and another stayed quiet." And that silence became concrete. A pause. The press leaned closer. "I don't want revenge," he continued. "I want truth, so no one like me disappears again." That night, Elena's new article ran with the headline, "Invisible No More, Harold Boone and the Fight to be Seen." It spread like wildfire. The mayor issued a public statement. Congressional offices took notice. The VA sent a liaison to meet Boone in person, something they hadn't done in decades. The local high school invited him to speak at Veterans Day. The museum offered to archive his letters and photos. And the city announced plans to reissue the Founders Plaza plaque with the correct names. Harold stood alone outside the old trailer one last time. The sun was setting, golden light spilling across the trees. He'd been approved for veteran housing downtown, clean walls, warm bed, real stove. He should have felt joy. Relief. But what he felt was simpler. He felt seen. He took one last walk to the plaza. This time, no marker in his pocket. Just a folder tucked under his arm. When he arrived, the statue stood the same, but the base had changed. The old plaque was gone. In its place was a new bronze plate. It bore two names. Staff Sergeant Harold M. Boone, Combat Rescue. Dr. Robert Green, Field Medic. And below them, For Courage Unclaimed and Truth Long Buried. Harold placed a folded paper beneath it. A copy of the original denial letter from the VA, now stamped reversed. It rained the day they unveiled the plaque. Not the bitter kind that stung your skin, but a soft, cleansing drizzle, like the city itself was washing something away. A canopy had been set up over the statue in Founders Plaza. Beneath it, chairs formed neat rows. Veterans sat shoulder to shoulder, medals pinned to old jackets, their posture still straight despite the weight of time. Harold stood off to the side in a crisp navy blazer they'd tailored just for the ceremony. His boots were polished. His beard trimmed. The old trailer behind the freight yard was now just a memory, distant, decayed, like a bunker left behind in some forgotten war. He didn't want to speak. But they asked him to. The same city official who once denied his housing stood nervously by the podium, glancing Harold's way with forced warmth. Elena gave him a small nod from the crowd. So Harold stepped forward. The silence was respectful, expectant. "I don't have much to say," he began, his voice hoarse but steady. "Because this," he gestured to the plaque, "should have happened 30 years ago." A murmur moved through the crowd. He raised a hand. "But I'm not bitter. Not anymore. Because the truth, even if it comes late, is still the truth." He paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Veterans. Reporters. Teenagers who had seen his arrest online. Too many men I knew died nameless. Too many went home in pieces, and the rest of us carried the weight, quietly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a dog tag, the chain looped tightly around his fingers. "This belonged to a friend of mine. Never got his name carved into anything. But he mattered." Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he walked to the base of the monument and laid the tag beside the plaque. Not for himself, but for all the ones who never got the moment. As he stepped back, someone in the crowd rose. A young man, maybe 20, wearing a faded Marine's hoodie. He lifted his hand in a salute, crisp, respectful, earned. Then another stood. And another. Soon the whole plaza was on its feet, not clapping, not cheering, just standing. Silent tribute to a man who had lived invisible for too long. Harold felt his throat tighten. But he didn't cry. Not here. A small girl broke the silence, pulling her father's arm. "Is he the one from the story?" Her father nodded. "That's him." The girl smiled at Harold. "Welcome home, mister." He gave her the smallest of nods. That was enough. Later, as the sun broke through the clouds, Harold remained at the monument. People had gone. Cameras shut off. He traced the letters of his name with his finger. The bronze was warm. Solid. Real. They tried to bury him, Elena had written in her final article, but he was the seed. He smiled at the words in his head. He hadn't wanted a legacy. Only the truth. And now, the world had listened.